Is it all good? Yeah. Okay, great. So now that we're settled with that, let's go on to some reminders. First, this is an AP tournament, and I'm pretty sure by now you know the rules of AP debating. But the important things to take note of include protected time from 0 to first minute and 6 to 7th minute. Secondly, please do time yourselves in order to ensure that you're not trying to give or accept UIs outside of or within rather protected time, or that you will potentially avoid overtiming in regards to your speech. Third, please be observant of equity policy. It's a finance motion. I don't think it's likely to happen, but just in case it might happen, please do note to be respectful to people you're debating with, but also people you may or may not be debating about. Okay? So, what is your veto, Rob?
We both vetoed the second motion.
Okay. So you're debating what motion?
No, we're debating the first motion.
Bailouts. Okay. All right. Debating on the motion, this House prefers Federal Reserve-driven bailouts as opposed to legislature-driven bailouts, calling on PM.
Oh, they're really gonna make me look at myself on this. I got the unfortunate side profile. Okay, let's go. The thing about the billions and billions of dollars that were used in the 2008 bank bailout in the United States is that we do not know where significant amounts of that money went. In the wake of that legislature-driven bailout, there were so little conditions attached to the release of that money that there is no doubt that millions of taxpayer dollars were pocketed into the very hands of the bankers that caused the recessions in the first place. A few things from proposition, firstly model, and then 2 arguments. One, on why the federal bank has better incentives, and then secondly, why the tools of monetary policy are a more efficient usage of bank bailouts. Firstly, into the model, I want to clarify a few things. What is the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve is essentially the central bank of a country. The primary job of a central bank is to control the value and production of money. So this is a bureaucratic body. It is not an elected body. Typically, the head of the central bank will be appointed by the government. This is typically a bipartisan position. An intuition pump for this is that in the Trump era, even though Trump threatened to replace the central bank head with someone that was aligned with his position, it is still relatively someone who is bipartisan, and in most democratic countries that have independent central banks, it is established that there is a bipartisan appointed head of the central bank. The second thing is that we think the primary goal of a central bank, as has been established by modern monetary theory in most countries, is to limit inflation and to stimulate growth in terms of setting interest rates, in terms of controlling the flow of money. We think that tends to be the primary goal of most of these institutions. In terms of monetary policy and what we support on our side, we think things like insurance policies and the adjustment of other uses is probably what we would use versus side opposition, which has to defend the use of fiscal policy, which usually comes out of taxpayer money or the government going into debt. The final thing that I want to note is that in terms of the Infoslide, bailouts in this case doesn't refer to the economy as a whole or an economic depression, but strictly refers to the bailout of financial institution when banks fail to protect things like people's savings and pensions, for example, the recent crash of the Silicon Valley Bank. That being said, on to the first argument then about incentives. There are 2 key pieces of framing that I want to give you about legislative bodies in most countries. The first is that they're elected by the public and they have primarily public-based incentives. The secondly is that they typically have no formal education in monetary theory or economics. The vast majority of politicians are not economists. Then I want to compare the performance-based incentives of central banks versus the election-based incentives of politicians. Central bank incentives and employees are hired based on expertise. So they typically have some kind of similar philosophy as the ruling government, but they tend to be fairly bipartisan, as I outlined before. The reason for this is that A, they tend to be highly educated and prominent in their fields. So they tend to be established and have a track record of things like academic trailblazing before they're appointed into their position into high roles in the federal bank. But the second thing that I very highly want to point out is that they have no shortage of job opportunities, is that they're typically hired because of the fact that many other institutions probably want to snap them up. And crucially, I want to point out that the federal bank head is a short-term position. So nobody takes jobs as major leaders within the federal bank because they think that is going to be a long-term position. It is standard that it is typically rotated out every few years as governments and philosophies change. Therefore, the assessment and the incentives of the person within those leadership roles in the federal banks are almost entirely performance-based, i.e., the chief goal that most countries establish as good monetary theory, which is in most places doing things like limiting inflation to, for example, under 3% a year, are the reputational incentives that they have. They want to be able to say that in their time at the federal bank, when they were appointed into this position to guardian the economy of that country, they were able to do a good job, and basically exclusively, their reputation in the future and the kinds of jobs they will be able to get in the future after the central bank is precedented on this. Thus, we think that when they use monetary tools in order to implement bank bailouts, they obviously want to make sure that the economy is not going to crash. So if the banks are in such a dire position that failing to bail them out will lead to the crash of the economy and lead to things like skyrocketing inflation or lead to drastic measures being taken, it is clear that the central bank will do what they have to do. If it is going to affect inflation more to have the banks fail, rather than to do things like adjust interest rates or use monetary theory to bail them out, we think that is clearly what they're going to do in this debate. I'll take that PY before I continue.
So if these federal banks care about the economy in the long term, they are willing to concede a lot of things like increasing interest rates. How do you deal with that?
The thing is that the incentives are balanced. And I'm going to talk about this now when I talk about the election-based incentives. Because the thing about the political campaigns about many politicians, especially in countries like the United States, is that they are bankrolled by banks and that they have significant lobbyists in their office every day from the major bank corporations. As they typically have strong incentives to protect banks, and that's why we see these, for example, crazy bailouts with very little strings attached that we've seen historically. Whereas the central bank as a whole is balanced. They only care about saving financial institutions to the extent that it doesn't affect the greater economy. So if raising interest rates is going to be more disastrous for the rest of the economy than allowing these banks to fail, that is obviously what the central bank is going to do. Comparatively to the election-based incentives, where because of the fact that many of them rely on the lobbying money and the political campaign from banks in order to win elections, we think they ought to have strong incentives to give out money with very strings attached. The second thing is, even assuming the best interests of legislators, because they're under significant pressure from the public when there is the possibility that banks might fail, they often make hasty decisions. So take, for example, the fact that the 2008 bank bailout was drafted and implemented extremely quickly without much administrative or bureaucratic input because of the fact that they feel the need to act rashly and they feel the need to act quickly. This means that we think the long-term concerns of the overall holistic health of the economy, because of the bank-aligned and citizen-aligned views of these politicians, are overall not as considered, and that leads to the irresponsible behavior that we've seen in the past. The last thing I want to note is that this also encourages more responsible bank behavior over time when they know that they cannot lobby governments to be too big to fail, but rather they have to actually adjust to the overall economy. We think banks are less likely to engage in risky behavior in the first place. But secondly, I want to talk about tools in terms of saving versus spending. The thing about the Reserve Bank and the central bank is that they have incentives to hedge against currency shocks. So because they know that there is a likelihood that they will need to spend money in order to bail out financial institutions, they typically have funds like the Federal Deposit Insurance, as outlined in the Infoslide, which are used in the event of a bank run. So for example, in terms of the recent collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank, it is the money from the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation that all banks put money into that is being used to bail out SVB. So rather than taxpayer money, it is actually the insurance money that banks have been paying for years that is being used to bail these banks out. The reason that governments cannot do this in terms of fiscal theory is because governments do not have similar incentives to hedge against shocks. When you are a democratic governor who always wants to spend money to fix more pressing political problems, when most governments run into debt every year, when there's very little savings left in the budget every year in most legislatures, there isn't similar incentives to have these hedging against currency shocks that we think banks are likely to do. For this reason, I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Let's call on your proposition.
Here.
is very myopic in this debate because they say that they want to protect people's savings, people's pensions, but do not nuance it as to how the Federal Reserve Bank is able to achieve this goal. They try to argue that one, most politicians do not know about fiscal policy, therefore they should not be in charge of trying to regulate these banks. I'd like to note that just because you're a politician, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily unqualified. Because a politician is meant to represent people's interests, the people's pensions that they want to defend in the first place. Note that politicians are able to pass things like the Inflation Reduction Act, or they're able to prevent stimulus packages from increasing in the economy simply because they know that it's bad. Therefore, politicians are able to weigh out interests of the economy and interests of the people. I don't know why you need an economics degree from Harvard to do that. Secondly, they try to say that, oh, the central bank will do what they have to do, so they'll know how to protect its people. I'd like to know that that's illogical, simply because if the central bank believes that they have to raise the interest against the people's interests, against the people's desires, or against people's wishes, they will do it anyway. So the people that they want to protect on their side of the house will be harmed regardless. Therefore, the delta has to be, how do we protect people regardless of what the central bank enacts? But thirdly, they say that, oh, we are able to prevent risky behavior, so they use the example of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Note that that's not exclusive under their side of the house, because on our side of the house, when we're able to use things like legislature-driven bailouts, we're able to legislate things like increasing the deposit limit insurance from $250,000 to something higher. But secondly, we're able to legislate things like making people spread their money around as opposed to consolidating it in one bank. So what is the conclusion to this rebuttal, therefore? On government side of the house, regardless of whether or not you have an economics degree, they conceded the fact that the central bank will do whatever they can to save the economy, regardless of whether or not it helps people. Therefore, the change has to be, how do we protect the people who are victims of the Signature Valley Bank and the Credit Suisse or things like that? No change under their model. What is the opposition going to argue in this debate? We're not going to argue why we have more flexibility in terms of changing the outcome to protect people, but secondly, we're going to talk about how preventive measures are likely to be legislated on their side of the house. Why are we more flexible on our side of the house? Note that the legislature can hold these companies accountable, and this can't happen on government side simply because they agree that they're independent from the government, so the only thing that they can do is control monetary policy as opposed to legislating better laws and things like that. The second, why is this true? Note that in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, they were able to legislate things. They were able to pass legislation quickly, which is an example that they used. Why is that good? One, people's jobs were at stake, people's pensions were at stake. People, the legislation reacted quickly simply because they were forced to under political pressure, because people felt like it was unfair that big banks had to be bailed out because it was their fault in the first place. Note that when there's political pressure to reverse legislation, it is likelier for the legislation to change on our side of the house, simply because you're able to stop lobbyists from Stanley Morgan to lower the deposit insurance or bank merger acquisitions or things like that. But secondly, I think we're able to hold things like Senate hearings with CEOs on our side of the house, which is what happened with Elizabeth Warren, and which is what happened with Bernie Sanders when the Lehman Brothers Bank failed. But thirdly, I think because we have the power of the pocket, we are able to do things like order loans from different countries or being able to raise the debt ceiling. But I think also lastly, we're able to legislate things like allowing banks to acquire smaller failing banks if that is what is necessary. So it's not just about giving money, it's about reasonably saving these banks. So if you look at Switzerland and how Credit Suisse was failing and how a bigger bank was able to acquire them, that is something legislature can achieve simply because they're able to create laws that regulate the mergers and acquisitions, simply because they're able to regulate who are we saving and things like that. I'll take the PY.
So this debate has nothing to do with legislation that is put in place after an economic crisis in order to stabilize the economy and banks in the future. This is about what we do when the bank is failing in that moment to prevent it from failing. How do you improve that?
Exactly, by approving mergers and acquisitions or not approving them. That's a legislature problem, not necessarily a Federal Reserve problem, especially if you talk about protecting banks in the future. I don't understand how you're able to protect them. What is the conclusion to this argument, therefore? One, there's greater accountability on our side of the house, simply because when the legislature is involved, we're able to hold people, CEOs, accountable. Secondly, we're able to regulate how we save these banks as opposed to just pouring money into them because we feel like that's what we need to do. Note that from the 2000 financial crisis, we were able to get the Frank-Dodd Act, or we were able to legislate things. We were able to prevent banks from being too big to fail, or things like that, or other mechanisms that were able to solve them. Why are preventive measures likely on our side of the house? Note that if you only focus on pouring money into the economy, which is what a government defends, you're not able to help the people on the ground. You're not able to solve another crisis like this from happening. One, there's we're able to concede to political pressure from the people to regulate these banks because these are taxpayer money. So note that political pressure looks like occupying the Occupy Wall Street movement, and it cannot happen on government side of the house simply because the FTC is independent from the state, so they're less likely to capitulate to political pressure. But secondly, they're not able to legislate regulations or laws simply because they can only recommend things as opposed to actually creating laws. Secondly, I think we're able to protect consumers' interests simply because we legislate that, for example, they need to spread their money around as opposed to consolidating it. But thirdly, I think people just generally can't understand why the FTC does things. If they concede that people from Harvard are the only ones who know how to deal with interest rate hikes, but all people can feel the repercussions regardless of whether or not you know how interest rates hike. So the conclusion to that means that the government is the legislation is the only body capable of protecting people, simply because they're able to legislate things that protect people from feeling the harms that come from banks failing, feeling the harms from their pensions being lost. What does that mean, therefore? On government side of the house, they have to reasonably defend why bailing out money consistently is the most important thing as opposed to legislating mergers and acquisitions, or being able to increase the federal deposit insurance. The Federal Reserve is not a legislative body. They can't do that. They can't defend that. Thanks.
Sorry, I think you did your opposition. Let's call on them from this side.
Can I start my speech? Okay. I know finance motions can be a bit confusing, so I want to make one very important clarification about the scope of this debate. This debate is about bailouts. Who finances the bailouts and who oversees the process of bailing out. Things like criminal hearings can happen on our side as well, because they happen after the bailout has already been completed. Things like merger and acquisitions can happen privately, does not require it to be part of the bailout process. If you want an example for this, the Binance proposed bailout of FTX was something that happened independent of government regulation and doesn't happen under a legislator-driven bailout. So, given that context of the scope of the debate, a large part of their case is irrelevant because a lot of their benefits of taking this bad banker to the court so that there can be justice can also happen on our side because criminal hearings are not part of bailouts. And so, with that, that's my response. My response to the majority of the case is, that's not the debate. Now let's talk about what is the actual debate. The actual debate, I know finance motions are very confusing, so I'm going to make it very simple for everyone. There are two things to consider, only two things. One is how are bailouts financed, and the second is what are the incentives of the Federal Reserve and what are the incentives of politicians. Not very complicated. It doesn't require a financial degree or a Harvard degree to understand my speech. The first thing about legislator-driven bailouts, which is part of the Infoslide, is that it's financed through fiscal policy. So Econs 101, right? Fiscal policy means increasing taxes and decreasing government spending. A large part of their case, ironically, was about how they wanted to protect the average person, the person on the ground, right? The grandmother with the pension funds. But how do you finance a bailout using fiscal policy? You increase taxes on the grandmother. You reduce social welfare spending so that they have less money to access things like social welfare or healthcare or subsidized government services. This means that in the interim, well, on their side, when the government is scrambling to pay out their bailout, the financial institutions that have failed cause people to have less income because the taxes are higher, they receive less social welfare, and there's overall less economic development. Because what they have to defend is fiscal policy to finance the money for the bailout, because when a financial crisis happens, the bank has no money, the government on their side needs to find a way to get money. There's only one way in which governments get money: they decrease the spending that already exists or they increase the taxes. So on their side, they have to defend a fiscally conservative environment that makes the lives of everyone much worse, especially the most vulnerable that is reliant on social welfare. But more importantly, it also slows down economic development. This is an important impact in the round, because if a financial institution has failed, this means that people have lost their jobs, people have lost their pensions, people have lost their savings, people are already suffering. If people are already suffering, you are going to increase taxes on the people suffering, you're going to reduce social welfare for the people suffering. It seems like this will worsen the economic situation and make things much worse. Given that this is the case, even if their side successfully achieves a bailout, this is traded off against the overall economic health, because there's less economic development given that there's less government spending, and there's less social welfare because there's reduced government spending. There's a principal reason as well for why people should not suffer for bailouts. No thank you. These financial crises were consequences of capitalist greed that the government failed to regulate. In the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, where subprime loans were collateralized in collateralized debt obligations so that the risk would be lower and they could sell more of it. These were products of capitalistic greed. Or in the recent Evergrande financial crisis, where the Chinese government failed to realize the mounting liabilities of the construction firm. These were failures of the government to regulate these firms. Why are people having to pay more taxes? Why are people receiving less social welfare in the event where the government has failed them, and in the event where bankers are being too greedy? Before I move on to the second part of my speech, I'll take the PYS.
How likely is it that these legislatures are going to take away from the necessities as opposed to things that are less important?
They have to do that because the motion says fiscal policy. I wonder how your magic money on your side if you do not do things like decrease government spending or increase taxes. Unless they say they want to give stimulus checks to bail out these people, which then on their side also results in inflation, which is the very harm that they were wanted to avoid. So I think the more strategic choice for their case is actually just to defend increases to taxes. Okay, Rina told you that the legislature is uniquely vulnerable to lobbying from financial institutions that finance the very campaign of the same politicians that are bailing them out. This is a huge conflict of interest. The people that are monitoring the bailout and managing the process of bailout are the people that receive their campaign finances from the very banks that are failing. This means that there's a lack of accountability and transparency. Whether the bailout goes to the savings and pensions, or whether the bailout goes to paying the salaries of CEOs and bankers, is not clear to us, because the legislature has a perverse incentive to pay back the favors that they owe towards all of these bankers and all of these financial institutions. But secondly, it also means that the focus of the bailout isn't purely financial recovery and minimizing debt contagion. Oftentimes, the purpose of the bailout is to protect bankers and to protect CEOs. The process of the bailout is obscured by political incentives, and therefore the bailout might be higher than necessary in order to pay the salaries of all of these CEOs in which the politicians have favors with. But lastly and most trivially, legislature is just more bureaucratic, because you need a political consensus where maybe one side wants to be fiscally conservative and the other side wants to be more fiscally liberal, which means that it's harder to find an agreement, especially during these very important situations, very dynamic situations where there are minute-to-minute changes in the event. It's very important for us to have a very fast and quick response. At the point in my speech, I want to point out that they give a bunch of things about what the government can do. They do not explain why the government is likely to do this, given the perverse incentives and the lobbying that we told you already in Rina's speech. Their concern was that the central bank would raise interest rates. At this point of my speech, I just want to say, raising interest rates wouldn't finance a bailout. Like, I do not understand how raising interest rates would finance a bailout, so there's no reason why central banks would do this. But this is unresponsive to the series of incentives that Rina told you about why they want to keep the economy healthy and why they have knowledge and competencies. But it's also unresponsive to the line of defense that Rina told you about how we're going to use the federal insurance to finance these bailouts. And this was an important impact in the round that they failed to respond to, because the stability of the banking system is based on investor confidence and depositor confidence. If people are afraid that their deposits will evaporate, this means that they'll pull out funds very quickly, making liquidity worse and causing bank runs. Like, this is how one one tweet on Twitter literally caused people to pull out all their funds from their crypto wallets on FTX. This means that on our side, when we're able to quickly provide full assurance because we have the federal insurance on our side of the house, this means people are less likely to quickly respond in such panic and desperate measures in order to pull out their funds. The impact of this is huge because at the point in which people pull out their funds very quickly from any financial institution, this often makes the financial crisis a lot harder to deal with because liquidity gets worse on their side. We provide more assurance for two simple reasons. The first is that we have the Federal Insurance Committee on our side of the house, and the second is that on their side, they are slow. They need a political consensus. That slowness, that difficulty to find a consensus is what causes the anxiety and panic and make people pull out all their funds. For all those reasons, actually proud to propose.
POI is by standing up, because sometimes people doesn't raise their hand. So I prefer to stand up because I can see you better. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Make no mistake, this debate is about economics, but it's also about governance. Who deserves the right or who has the responsibility to be able to protect and bail out these industries and the people affected by them? And that is why we are important in this debate, because we tell you that there are incentives in place for politicians to be able to respond to the needs of the people on the ground, which are not usually translated to the numbers on the GDP or the numbers on the interest rate, which we tell you are the things that are exclusive on opposition bench and they cannot solve, primarily because they give you the technical stuff and tell you that this doesn't need any Harvard degree, but we tell you that what they need is impacting and weighing, which they do not give and cannot backload from WHIP. I'm going to do 3 things. Number 1, I'm going to have 2 issues about number 1, our financial crisis. Where do we solve financial crisis better? And this is about the capacity to bail out. Number 2, I'm going to talk about where do we develop the economy better. But number 3, I'm going to talk about just where are incentives better. On the first one, we argue that on the issue of capacity, we prove to you coming from SanTP that we prove that legislature-driven has more ways to help failing industries and firms when they do enter this crisis. And if we prove this, then we tell you, and if we prove that states and legislations have more capacity to be able to help them, then they therefore have more of a responsibility to help them, and that's why they need to be the one to do it. What are the structural reasons that we gave to you? And I'm going to add more as to why this is so true. Number 1, SanTP already gave you the power of the purse, which suggested that they have the power to budget and allocate the things that they have, which therefore responds to what government is saying, that we're going to have to reallocate so many, or we're going to have to pull out so much money for welfare, and therefore helping so much, it's detrimental because we're not helping people on the ground. That's untrue. What it only means is that we can retain the amount of money that we have for welfare because that's urgent, but remove money from things that we don't really currently need, like for example, defenses, which has so much budget, but now we have the power for the purse to be able to reallocate. That's funny, but it's true. But number 2, checks and balances. The structure of the government is the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. The fact that there are more points to be able to check and balance whether or not the procedure of the bailout is true, or whether or not the procedure of the bailout is something that is ethical or something that is good, means that we have a lot more capacity to be able to, I don't know, get a lot more opinions about the topic, or get a lot more relevant infrastructure or relevant resources coming from different branches of the government. But thirdly, we also have so much more access to money. When we talk to you about foreign reserves, loaning policies, increasing the debt ceiling, and moreover maybe taxation, but that's not really popular, so we don't think taxation is something that we stand for. Therefore, we tell you that there are 2 implications. Number one, we're able to adjust based on the scale of the problem. Under their side, sure, the banks in Silicon Valley have failed, but what if there's another, like 2008 financial crisis, that happens on a much larger scale? Does the central bank have enough money when they also like put restrictions on how much they can loan or how much money they can push out? This means that under our side, we can scale our help so much more, and therefore we can help them so much faster or much more immediately later. But number two, even if taxpayer money is used, like that's our worst case because obviously that's not the only thing we resort to, then we tell you that it's consented use and usually means that this policy helps them either way. What are the impacts of this? Number one, this means that spending on scale means we are able to respond to the problems urgently if it is large scale, therefore our bailouts are much more effective. But number two, because they have the incentives of the voters in mind, that means they have the much more urgency to be able to focus on this first rather than other economic problems, which we posit government also has a lot of other significant economic problems, like for example trade or for example other crises in other parts of the economy. Therefore, at the very least on our side, we have the benefit of urgency and responding to it better. But number two, the implication or the impacts of this on our side is that we just have so much more systematic solution making, which means that we're able to translate our policy towards other parts of our institutions, like the government, like the legislature, whether or rather the judiciary or the executive, which means that we have more capacity to fund risk reduction management or future-proofing financial institutions by instituting restrictions for example, people on the ground, or for example, big or too big to fail companies when they get too cocky to be able to do these things. When they tell you that this is irrelevant, no, this is literally part of our policy and this is something that exists in status quo, and we tell you this is good because number one, and this is the conclusion, sure, historically, taxpayers were not paid in the 2008 financial crisis, but at the very least, we were able to survive, the US was able to survive their crumbling economies and people not being able to afford their mortgages and housing, and not people starving because they have to use so much money. The urgency gets to resolve, but also number two, in the longevity, at the very least, we have more permanence in our policy making and our response, and therefore we prevent any future types of like crises that happen on our side, whereas their side, when it comes up, you have to solve it. When it comes up, you have to solve it. They're only reactionary. They do not get the benefit that we are asking for. Therefore, our side is more permanent when it looks like Dodd-Frank Act that allows people to become more willing to be able to like invest in things like that. Yeah, sure, PY.
The thing about increasing government debt is that it's not bipartisan, which means that Democrats struggle to waive the debt ceiling because Republicans always want more taxes. How do you then find
so it's good sometimes that it's not bipartisan because at the very least we know what people need on the ground, and I do not think so. This is a liberal bias that I do not understand. Why does everything have to be bipartisan? Sometimes Republican material or conservative ideologies about the economy might be possibly good, and I therefore do not think that you can discount that immediately under their side. So yeah, weird. Second issue, right? I'm going to do this really quick. So how bad are financial crises, or how do we solve this? Know that under our side, financial problems are not monolithic. These are usually multifaceted and unpredictable, which they concede is true. But however, government or PM and DPM only argue to you that there are like simple solutions to these problems. Like developing the economy is about interest rates or doing some other monetary policy. We think that monetary policy is inherently restricted because the only thing that you have control over is what you use the money that already exists for. But what do you do when you need more money? What do you do when you have to use this money for other things? We don't think that they're able to have the flexibility that we have under our side when you are able to help the economy for example, things like cryptocurrencies, which we don't think that like primarily central banks have a lot of like liquidity towards. But moreover, we're not like under their side, they're not able to respond to SMEs, for example. So under the example of the STC, sure, it's focused a lot on like for example the central bank giving that money, but it was the state who said that we're going to give back their bank deposits for people who are incapable or the people who are most vulnerable, like SMEs. But finally, why do we win this debate? We win this debate because we tell you why this capacity is something that you cannot extract under their side, but moreover why the economy develops better under our side. We tell you that the capacity dictates how much we can recover in the future. If we cannot solve this urgently and if we cannot protect the people now, it's going to devolve into much worse and worse things like other like institutions defaulting, and that's why they lose. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Deputy Leader for this issue. Let's now talk about government report.
Can I start? Okay, give me some water first. I know this debate might be confusing, so I'm just going to start out by being very clear about what both sides stand for. On government side, we stand for calculated bailouts. There are instances where we won't bail out companies that are or banks that are necessarily that won't harm the economy when they die out, or these banks necessarily are like doing a lot of bad practices in and of itself. On their side, what they stand for is complete bailout, bailing out every single banks and every single companies in the industry insofar as they want to protect their grandmother's pension or whatnot. The problem on opposition side, therefore, is that every time they choose to create greater legislation to give money to people or to bail out more and more companies, that necessarily means that the federal government has to do things like get to be more in debt, for instance, to spend more money in and of itself. So they have to print more money to do these kinds of things. When this happens, it's a point where you jack up inflation rates, which is far worse for the country, and that's what we oppose on government in this debate. Let's first talk about the incentive structures of both legislative branches and the Federal Reserve in and of itself. We told you clearly from Rina that the Federal Reserves are much more like they have better incentives because one, they tend to be smarter people, right? They come from an academic background, they come from like universities or whatnot. Second, they easily get another job at the point in which their term in the federal bank, in the central bank, and so they can easily get a job. They don't have to they don't have to cater to people who will lobby to them because they easily get financial security in the future. Lastly, because of the fact that it's a short-term position, it means they don't have to worry about getting re-elected constantly. But the conclusion of all of this is that it's bipartisan. They often care about the economy in specific ways to try to protect the economy in the long term. They will balance out the economy with the concerns of people on the ground. In comparison, the legislative branch is far more susceptible to things like lobbying because of the fact that people will spend money to ensure that they bail them out, for instance, or try to lobby for them for favors, right? They tell us that, well, politicians are smart too, they can make good policies. But the problem is that they don't engage with what Rina tells you about how in which these politicians are, one, lobbied, two, don't really have the economic background to make good decisions. But they secondly tell us that, well, political pressure will cause these politicians to make good policies. Why and how, they don't really explain why this necessarily happens. We think that bailouts will happen on both sides of the house, but the difference is that the bailouts that happen on our side of the house is much better for three reasons. The first reason is because we guarantee more accountability insofar as the people making those bailouts aren't lobbied by the banks themselves. So the kinds of bailouts that happen are necessarily much more accountable in that sense. Secondly, the Federal Reserve has much more tools. For instance, the insurance, the fact that they have insurance, for instance, to ensure that banks that need bailout will get it, but also ensuring that we don't have to take taxpayers' money in order to fund that bailout. The last reason is because, yeah, we don't have to take taxpayers' money, so that's a good thing. But the question I want to ask is, where do politicians get their information when they're trying to create a bailout? Their claim is, well, politicians will make perfect legislations in order to ensure that they get the best outcomes for everyone. The problem is that when you are a politician without an economic degree, when you don't know the ins and outs of the financial institutions, you have to ask the bank themselves for information of like what's going on. For instance, they say politicians have a lot of information. They can get like expertise from all around the world. The problem is that the information from the bank itself, for example, let's say Maybank goes into like financial crisis, right? Other banks themselves aren't going to know why Maybank necessarily went into that financial crisis. You don't have the bank books of Maybank, for instance. That is to say that the only way to get information about how to like determine the best kinds of policies to be created is to ask Maybank themselves what are the like reasons that you are in this economic situation, how can we help you? And that's where all the massive problems of accountability come into place. At the point where your Maybank, for instance, can like make false causes for this for politicians to push forward their bailout policies. The end result, therefore, is that at the point in which the primary information of economic policies come from the banks themselves or other companies that require bailouts, that's when you get a lack of accountability under their side of the house. The comparative, therefore, is that on our side of the house, when you have the like people in the Federal Reserve with actual like economic backgrounds, where they know how to solve the problem that is distinct from how the banks are telling them, that's when you actually get better bailouts being created, but one that has actually much more transparency in and of itself. Sure.
So are these states and legislators just stupid and incompetent?
I'm saying they're not stupid, it's just that they don't have a lot of information. And as a result, what happens is that they have to ask the bank themselves for that information, which is problematic. But also, secondly, they are often lobbied, so they have bad interests, right? It's good, they're quite smart, like it's good for them because they get money, but it's bad for the country itself because their incentives are bad. Okay, what then are the other stuff we told you? We told you that, well, the fact that the Federal Reserve has insurance payouts is necessarily a good thing, because that means that you get greater assurance in the economy, that when investors and people who give money to the banks know that they don't have that the economy is secured to a certain extent, they won't do things like take out all their money from the bank and cause the bank to have lesser liquid assets in of itself. Therefore, you better the economy on the outside. But the implication of this is important, and the lack of response from their second speaker is also important, because if their claim is that we want to protect the poor grandmother who doesn't have any money, who might lose their pensions, it's under our side where we actually protect that, because we prevent massive economic shocks from necessarily happening in the first place, in comparison to their side, which recklessly spend money in of itself. I want them to note that the strategy on their side about trying to bail out companies is also problematic, because they want to spend more money for these kinds of individuals. But the problem is that at the point where that happens is when inflation necessarily goes up, which means that your poor grandmother no longer has enough money to buy their own basic necessities when the prices of goods necessarily increases because of inflation. But the problem therefore is this. Okay, never mind, I'll skip this part. I'll just get into their best case. Let's assume, but then it tells us why we get legislation. We already told you that legislation is symmetric. But even if it wasn't symmetric, the problem is that even if it was an exclusive benefit on their side, we're willing to take that trade-off for the simple reason that if our policies are much better, then we can balance inflation while also bailing out companies. Then the end result is that we are able to preserve the economy from further economic shocks in the future. Their side doesn't guarantee that because of the multitude of reasons that we've given you, right? But the problem therefore is that under their side of the house, we guarantee more long-term sustainable, under our side of the house, we guarantee more long-term sustainable economic growth and at least the preservation of economic situations in comparison to their side. Note that therefore, if the case is, well, they say we will continue causing the economy to go into shocks in the future, we don't, because we have better policies in of themselves. For those reasons, we propose.
Alright, thanks government coach. Let's call on opposition whip.
you do not have the capacity to properly bail somebody out because you have limits to the loans you can give, because there are limitations that do not happen because of the FDC, we think opposition wins this debate. First, let's start a discussion on the issue of capacity. Because note we posit a few things that they didn't respond to very well. Legislators have the power to mobilize so many more things, and they have the power and capacity to do so many more things, none of which they have properly responded to. Things like the power of the pocket, where you're able to actually loan from other countries, or conditions on bailouts that they claim you can't have. We think there's even more capacity for the legislators to put conditions on bailouts simply because they need the assurance that these companies that they do bail out will pay them back, simply because they need the assurance that they can continue protecting their people. We think it's just a false assumption that these legislators do not care and they're just handing and throwing out money to failing companies. Note then, how do they respond? Because they say this is irrelevant, this is for the future. But we argue this is the most important thing, simply because you cannot do any of that under the FDC. They are not like the companies and banks that you bail out are not beholden to the state, because the FDC is its own entity. You cannot force banks to have better management, which is the reason why they fail and they needed a bailout in the first place. The tipping point here is you are now under our responsibility of the state. You are under our bailout conditions, and not only are you preventing future bailouts, but in this current bailout, you're able to make better decisions on things like acquisitions, mergers, and all of that following us. Sure, the FDC can bail out these financial institutions. That's a possibility. But note that they don't do it to an enough degree. SANTP already shows you that. Two conclusions here. One, we have more capacity. Secondly, we have more flexibility to fill out all of the things that the FDC is super strict on, because they're unable to do these things. How do they respond and how do they clash? At best, they say, well, you don't have capacity because you don't have competent individuals. A few things I want to note. We still have financial advisors. I don't understand why they don't think we can have the same information, why we can have the same power by just hiring somebody from Harvard, by just hiring financial advisors who understand the same things. This means we don't make the hasty decisions that they claim we make, because these legislators go through so many things like due processes, things like talking about it in the Senate or consulting all of their financial advisors, which the state can afford. But even if their whole point is not saying that we're incompetent, I want you to note that it is not a lack of information, because the government can just demand information from the departments that have this information. In the first place, their entire point already falls. Note then, it's not going to happen when there's an economic collapse because of bad decisions. This is simply because the legislators have the capacity and the incentive to care about things. The lack of accountability that they argue is where they're like, there's a whole perverse incentive. Understand, this is exactly why people talk about it in the Senate, right? This is why you vote and things like that. It's unlikely that these are always perverse. Understand that on the response of the whole voting thing, it's either their response to us is just to say, either they discuss and contend, and then their deputy says, oh, it'll take so long for you to get your benefits. But there's a tension here, and I want you to note this. They say that it's going to take so long, yet their PM argues that you're rash, you're hasty, you're irrational, simply because you act too quickly. And to quote them, they say the government acted quickly during the 2018 financial crisis. I think they have to pick one, because the harm they're trying to push onto us is that we don't get the benefits very quickly, because we have all of these different things that take a while. Sit down. Understand then that this tension harms their case, but it also harms their response onto us. Let's talk about accountability. No politicians side with voters, because venture capitalists cannot finance a campaign that doesn't exist in the first place. Bipartisan pressure exists because all sides care about the money that is in the failing banks. Even on their best case, where bipartisan pressure does not exist, I want you to understand that Haduka already tells you it's not always great, it's not always horrible to have maybe some conservative economic beliefs or policies. These things, it's not immediately an a priori good if you are more progressive with your economic policies then. Understand that it's simply untrue where they get more accountability, because you're literally the state. You are the Senate, so you have laws, you have checks and balance systems, you have other systems and departments like the judiciary necessary to keep you in check. You are literally under the scrutiny of the people, as opposed to the FDC, where you're even less likely to have accountability because nobody knows what the hell is happening with the FDC in the first place. You are beholden to the people that you are trying to protect. You have things like obligations and expectations to be even more transparent. I'll take the POI.
Why do you think the Federal Reserve has like huge limits on their bailouts and are unable to put conditions on the bailouts they give?
Because they don't have the power. I don't know. Like, just because there's a voter interest, it doesn't always make it bad. It is representative of what the people want, right? Understand that the trade-off they take under our legislation is simply to say we have better policies. But one, they don't explain these better policies. They don't tell you how it's better, why you get it, what it is in the first place. But also, secondly, they take a trade-off of regulation. They take the trade-off, the protection of the economy that opposition offers to you. What are our benefits and impacts? How do we achieve this? Note that it's likely we're able to help these industries more simply because of all the reasons we told you, right? We adjust on the scale of the problem. So this means as the legislator, you're able to adjust these things because not all crises are the same. Some are smaller, some are bigger, some bailouts create millions while some only need a little bit of money, right? The capacity of risk reduction and the capacity to handle these harms are greater because government operates on a reactionary measurement while we operate on a preventative and like present measurement. During the bailouts, the acquisitions and mergers that the legislation can regulate are what helps the economy. The conclusion is simple. None of them respond to Haduka. Not every point that Haduka tells you still flies because they just can't be bothered to respond. But also, this means you punish them because we are now more certain. We have more analysis and we have weighing that they don't talk about. We still stand. Let's talk about their side very quickly then. Note on their side, they'll have monetary policies, maybe increase interest rates, and then give loans to the bailouts and support them. But maybe investors will be now more like confident to invest and come back into it to save these industries that do bailout. We have that too. We can still get the money and loan it to them. But the difference here is that we have a more potent incentive for investors to come back because they trust the government more than they trust like the FCD. Because they trust the policies that you're making, you're more likely to have investors bounce back, therefore making it even more likely for your economy to be safe. If you want all of those benefits, vote for opposition. Here.
Thank you, Opposition Whip. Let's now move on to reply exchange with Opposition Reply.
Good? I can start?
Yeah.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The gaping hole on government's bench is that they give you a lot of mechanisms and they give you a lot of things why they have a lot of good impacts, and maybe they prove that these are likely. We don't think so. But a lot of the problem is that they do not weigh why this is more important than the impacts we give. When we tell you that we have a lot more scalability based on whether or not it's small or big, based on the severity of the harms, whether or not the people at the top are harmed or people at the bottom are harmed, we can respond to that. And whether or not this is more long-term or short-term, when we tell you that we have more preventative measures, we tell you that's far more important because it significantly reduces the harms of snowballing into big financial crises, but also prevents these things from happening in the first place. I think that when we gave you these pieces of weighing, it's very, very significant in the round. Why? Because if you assume that both sides equally argued these things, it means that you have to lean on the opposition bench to be able to believe that something is more important when we tell you that there are incentives that are related to the economy that are not just for businesses or the people or the banks that have fallen into crisis, but also the people that have been affected by these crises, which are the people on the ground, the people who have been loaning from these banks, the people who deposit from these banks, and even people people from rural areas who might have been just offshoots of the harm. I'm going to do three things in this reply speech. Number one, I'm going to tell you why we win on the potency of bailouts, which is the win that they're trying to win on, government is trying to win on. Number two, I'm going to tell you about why we develop the economy better. But number thirdly, we're going to give you an issue about safety, which we think is the most fundamental thing in this debate. First one, potency of bailouts. Government just gave 3 standards. They have more accountability coming from it. Number 2, they have specialized people who can help them more. Number 3, they have more information from banks. None of these are exclusive mechanisms at all, and we gave you a lot of material as to why that's not true. But the way that we win this round is because we tell you that the extents of these are much more significant under our side. Why? States are much more accountable to people, to financial systems, to institutions that believe on them. We told you already that they are like part of the tripartite of the government. But also, we tell you that we also have financial analysts and experts, which are important in this debate. But thirdly, we tell you that we can also get all of the information that they argue we cannot have from subpoenas and judiciary power. So, because we have all of these things already, why is it any necessary that another entity will do all of these things when we told you that they do not have the utmost capacity to be able to do these things when the worst case happens? And we tell you that the worst case is the most important part of this debate, primarily because that's where most of the harms exist. That is where the domino effect of the problems exist. And if they are not able to solve that, that means we win. And since we did that, we win. So on opposition, what we tell you is that the scale is unpredictable and we have a responsibility to prevent. And their response was, well, they had no response, and there was an assertion from WHIP that they can also prevent things from happening, which I think is just far too late. So the standing here is that to small or big, so I've already concluded that. The second thing is about the development of economy, which I think was pretty okay coming from government. The government vaguely gestures about how monetary policy will suddenly develop, and therefore that's the debate they're trying to win on. But this assumes that there is some potency to these things. When we told you, coming from SanTP, our first speaker, preempted these things by telling you that economic monetary policy is almost always indirect, and almost usually is not central to the people on the ground, or because they do not understand these things, and therefore they have no control over what kinds of changes the central bank will be able to make under their side, and therefore we question, is their development of economy even relevant when you're just bumping up some numbers in the GDP, you're just bumping down some numbers in the interest rate? We do not understand why this is relevant. So in the worst case, it's a deadlock. At the best case, we win because of weighing. But finally, just to wrap up this debate, we tell you that we're just much more safer. When the state has already had experience, when we told you, coming from my deputy speech, that we have experience to be able to do these things better in the future, we tell you that this preventative measures that we give you is something that is the crux of this debate, and the thing that we have to weigh on. Thanks.
Thank you, Opposition Reply. To close this quarterfinal, let's call on Government Reply.
Two areas of this debate. Firstly, which side has the better tools to fix the system? Secondly, which side has the better incentives to do so? Let's talk about the tools. First, I want to establish what is not mutually exclusive. A number of the mechanisms that proposition gives you, such as implementing legislation that requires banks to, say, have more capital reserves, or prosecuting people who may have made risky financial decisions, does not happen during the initial bailout phase of banks. In fact, this typically happens months, if not years, in the aftermath. This is not exclusive to their side. But even if you don't believe this, they have not proved whatsoever that this legislation actually happens. The Dodd-Frank Act was repealed in most parts by the Trump administration. There was barely a single banker prosecuted in the wake of the 2008 crisis. This still doesn't respond to any of the analysis incentive that we give you on our side. Now, let's do a direct comparison of our tools. Where is the money coming from on our side? The only accusation they've made as to why we cannot bail out banks is that somehow we don't have enough money or we don't have enough capacity. Firstly, the very first thing I told you in the model is that central banks control the money supply. Central banks literally pew, 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 print money. That's who gets money. We don't think that this is necessarily a limitation on our side. But secondly, we gave you a very explicit incentive that is actually being used right now with the SVB bank crisis, which is that because central banks have an incentive to hedge against bank runs and bank shocks, they are more likely to save significant amounts of investment and insurance money in order to pay that back out when shocks and crises do happen. That is where the money is coming from. The mechanism, the example that we've been telling you down our entire bench, the other team does not reply to. What that means is that this money is much more stable. There's a lot more investor confidence because their deposits are insured by central banks, and we get all the impacts we're able to do. What are the harms on their side that they have never responded to? The fact is that to raise money, you have to do a few things. You have to raise debt, which you have to pay interest payments on. You have to pay back in the future. And to pay it back in the future, you need to raise taxes, which is bad for the average person, or you need to cut spending, which is also bad for the average person. We think the idea that the US is going to cut military spending before they cut welfare spending is probably pretty ludicrous in this debate in terms of who has power and political power within the state. We don't think the poorest members of society are probably that. So fundamentally, if we ignore all the incentives in this debate, what we see debate is that they haven't actually responded in any meaningful way as to how they are going to prevent people from facing the brunt of all the horrible impacts of the debt that they have to raise in order to finance fiscal policy, whereas we give you a fairly simple idea of how monetary policy is able to help out companies. Secondly then, let's talk about who have incentives. The first thing I want to note is that they haven't actually proved that we have any bad incentives. All they've told us is that, but we only care about the economy. But recognize that what is good for the economy is also what is good for the average citizen. When there is skyrocketing inflation, that is very bad because groceries are expensive. When a bunch of people and businesses lose their pensions and their savings and their deposits, that is very bad for the economy because people have no more money to spend. We think that what is aligned in the interest of the average person is that they want the economy to do good, they want inflation to be controlled, and they want growth to be encouraged, and that just means that you have more jobs, you're more happy, you have groceries on the table. We don't think they've actually proved in any meaningful way that just because we do not cater or do not get elected by the people, that central banks actually have any mixed incentives or negative incentives. Whereas on their side of the house, while they might be true that in some ways politicians do have incentives to cater to the average person, we at the very best prove that they have mixed incentives. That to some degree they care about the people, but they also have to raise money through lobbying. So even in their best case, they still have a multitude of incentives, whereas we give you one clear incentive that works. And the problem with this is that they claim that the average person is going to be able to hold them accountable. But the problem is that the average person doesn't pay attention to the minutiae of bailout policy. As soon as the average person knows that their pension or that their savings are guaranteed, it's very unlikely that the average person is able to hold the government accountable to make sure that the bailout money is actually going into all the right places, and that it goes to the right companies, and that it's the right size. We think that it's only with the incentives and the education that we gave you on our side that central banks are able to carry this out. For all those reasons, I am very proud to propose.
Thank you, government reply, and thanks everyone for that wonderful round. I've been told by Orcom to tell you guys that it's going to be announcement first and then lunch. So go straight to the convening hall and just wait for all of us to come back so we can give you this. Yes, just let me know within 10 minutes if you have a decision already, so you can make that happen. Thank you. Yeah.
Papa chose us when he walked on the we shine.
I mean, he was like the 3 years shit.
I think Papa just like, oh shit, the paper stuff.